to you.
Well, let's crack on.
Up to it.
Okay, cool. Yeah, I think we've 5 minutes in, so might as well. All right. So hello, everybody. Welcome to this webinar on car sharing with Arval, Invers and Share Now. Thanks very much for your time. I'm Harry Maxwell, and I'm the head of marketing and growth at Fluctuo, which is also the host of this webinar, of course. So for those of you who don't know us, we're the leading aggregator of shared mobility data in Europe. So this is shared bikes, shared cars, shared scooters and shared mopeds. But today, of course, we'll only be focusing on the cars. Very excited to get started and to present this great panel we've got lined up. Just quickly before we get into it, I just wanted to explain the structure. So I'll start with a quick introduction to car sharing in all its forms, as well as surfacing a few market statistics today. Then we'll enter our main discussion with our experts so we can dive deeper into a few subjects. And for the last 10 minutes, we'll save time for a Q&A. So please drop any burning questions you have for our panel in the questions tab, which I believe you'll find in the bottom right-hand corner next to the chat. So quite easy to see there. Feel free to drop them throughout, and then at the end, we'll hopefully get to them. So the last thing to do, of course, now is to introduce our panel of experts. So firstly, we have Simon Coppenol, who is the Global Head of Car Sharing and Mobility Hubs at Arval. Welcome, Simon.
Welcome to everyone. Well, thank you, Harry.
Secondly, we've got Bharath Devanathan, who is the Chief Business Officer at Invers. Welcome.
Thanks, Harry. Hi, everyone.
And finally, Sven Hyen, who is the Head of Public Affairs at car sharing company Share Now. Great to have you, Sven.
Thank you, and hi, everyone.
Cool. Now, so for those that are familiar with Fluctuo will know that we produce a quarterly report on the shared mobility market. We have just finished, 2 weeks ago, we released our most recent edition, which if you have your camera ready, you can download with the QR code there if you haven't already. So what did we find? Well, we found that there are 65,000 shared cars in Europe, which is free-floating and station-based services. And these shared cars racked up a total of 720 million. This is the amount of euros generated by the trips. And we also witnessed a growth of 26% on 2022 compared to 2021. It's fortunate that we have a car sharing operator with us on the panel. So maybe Sven, I just wanted to bring you in here to ask, see how you see this growth, and also why you see car sharing as having such a big potential.
What is astonishing for me is that this growth was happening in COVID times, right? So everyone here was part of what has been happening. Cities were suspending traffic completely and so on. And despite that, actually, the figures have been growing. What you see here, especially in the last few months, the exponential growth was starting to get back again. It was the expectation we had all in the past. For Chanel, for example, to also give you that value, we were growing by 30% in the turnover in the last few years in the COVID times. So reasoning is, of course, adoption of car sharing is something that we see in all the different cities, but also that people feel the need for it, that they really use the cars. And I think that's a great achievement in the end for all of us.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. And talking about great achievements, I mean, we recently McKinsey published a study finding that the car sharing market in Europe is today worth around 3 billion. This is including peer-to-peer car sharing. And we're hoping this will grow to 4 in 2030. So as you said, there's definitely room for growth, but it's great to see that we're already getting back to where we should be despite this small lapse with COVID. But of course, car sharing is not just about the free-floating station-based and peer-to-peer services. So I just wanted to highlight a few business models to watch, which is corporate car sharing, which is driving down the costs and increasing simplicity for businesses. Carpooling, which is using users who are sharing private cars to reduce their personal costs and emissions. So official statistics published by the French government now shows that there are 10 times as many carpool trips than 2 years ago. I've got someone trying to enter my room here, so sorry, bear with me a second. And finally, the third one is car rental. So these are the traditional rental services that are continuing to gain popularity in Europe. And I found quickly that there are 40 million users in Europe in 2022 of these traditional car rental services, but this is looking to grow to 54 million in 2023. So there's obviously lots to be excited about. And having said all this, it's time to actually turn to our experts. So we'll continue with Simon now. So Simon, why do you believe that car sharing has such a big potential?
Thank you, Ari. So you said in the introduction with about corporate car sharing. So today what we see is that actually corporate car sharing may be a niche, but it's getting more and more interesting to company for a simplistic reason. Is it that actually it meets what are their business goals? It answers their needs in different ways. Of course, let's be humble. Most of the companies are looking towards cost efficiency and reduction of operation cost. So first and foremost, as you know, for company, cost for mobility is an important cost center. And of course, car sharing can be seen as a solution for them, for fleet operators, for businesses, to a way to actually improve the usage rate of the fleet, make more with what they actually do. That's one point. But also the second time, that's mostly something that we actually see with the commercial fleets. It's also to reduce the idle time of their fleet. Once again, with the idea to make their vehicles, their fleet run all the time. But you would ask me, corporate, but what is it for me as an employee? How that interests me? Actually, what we've seen over the recent years is first that a drastic improvement in the quality of the user experience, of the quality of the customer journey provided by car sharing apps and car sharing platforms. Also, important to mention that car sharing is actually adding another block, another alternative to the mobility means, constituting the mix for the employees, adding another option for those who want commuting by bike. We see more and more employee coming by bike, but every once in a while they still need a car, and this is making the life much easier. Also, and that is more and more important, especially for the newer generation, is that they want to be empowered. They don't want to be using cars by asking the manager, going at the reception. Actually, technology provides them with an application and a direct capacity to actually do it on their own. They don't need someone. They can just book and enjoy the ride just with the app, without the help of someone. Last and foremost, and that's a mega trend, and that's going to be even more important throughout times, is the CSR importance of the reducing the carbon footprint for companies. And of course, car sharing services can be seen as a way to push alternative fuels vehicles or emission-free vehicles. We see city center preventing a combustion engine going in. Still, company needs to be able to have a solution, but they need something to enable and change the mindset of the employees. And for sure, car sharing can be a way of doing that.
Absolutely. Thank you, and just to bring in Barath now, because we haven't heard from you yet. Just on the surface, what do you think the big breakthrough for car sharing will be in 2023?
Yeah. So, I mean, car sharing has been around for a while, and we've been lucky to have a vantage point as Invers to witness several car sharing sort of companies, business models grow and emerge, and sort of have a first-hand view of these trends. What we see happening in 2023 are a few big, I would say, breakthroughs or developments. The first one that we're beginning to see is like cooperation between the different mobility players. So earlier there was competition, there still is competition, but now I think it's cooperation and competition together. For example, mobility players are coming, car sharing operators are coming together to sort of have a unified voice for regulations or for the city. So they approach the city saying, okay, these are our difficulties, these are our challenges, and this is what we would like. And there's a unified voice behind that. They also sort of cooperate for infrastructure. So the city provides parking, and all sorts of infrastructure that is being shared by operators more and more. We also see a trend where operators, car sharing operators, actually share assets. So they share, private parkings. They share actually cars themselves between operators, which is a very good sign for the city as well. And we also see another trend where they also share services. For example, how do you infleet cars into your fleet? How do you defleet them? How do you maintain them? How do you rebalance cars? These are all operations that all car sharing operators have to do. And now, if you share this service, or if one of them becomes an expert, they can sort of help others, and vice versa, and reduces the cost. So this cooperation between car sharing operators is something we see as a big trend. We also see, as a second point, all of them sort of now progressing, strongly and heavily on the path towards profitability. And it's given, it was important before, and it's even more important now given the macro situation. And so, how do they reduce their costs in their P&L? How to increase revenues? Prominent costs are, costs of damages to the cars, personal costs that are needed to maintain these cars. So these are all sort of things that they're paying attention to now, and looking at technology to help them sort of on this path. The third sort of dimension we see also is how can they improve customer experience. So right now, there are many operators which provide a great customer experience, but it's a different experience for each vehicle. So they're looking at providing the same experience across all vehicles, across all cities they operate, across all countries they operate, and so on. And the last one, which is I would say in some ways the holy grail that everyone is looking to, is personalization. So when you get into a shared car, does it change the settings in the language that you want? Can it remember your seat? Can you remember your favorite sort of radio station? Connect to your Spotify and so on. So these are things that will really sort of drive customer experience up quite a few notches. And these are sort of trends that we see all of them sort of moving towards.
Is this what you're seeing, Sven? Does that resonate with you, about saying about the user experience, etc.?
Exactly that. In the end, most of what you said are totally right, but also to extend on that, car sharing itself is getting out of becoming a niche market, so to speak. It's becoming more widespread. It's becoming also more recognized by regulatory makers, for example. So cities do think finally car sharing makes sense. Cars are driving around. They're not just being stuck on a parking spot, but actually they are moving. People can use them for individual mobility, for corporate use cases, like Simois explained, but also for private use cases. If I want to go shopping, I can use the car even if I don't have one, and just for the use cases I need. And that's in the end what all adds up to the breakthrough of it even more in 2023. We are teaming up also EU-wide, just that as an example, with other players. We are talking to EU government makers that they are finally formalizing car sharing, that they incorporated even into structures about electric mobility and so on. So it's finally recognized, and this took a little bit, but in the end, it really seems to be paying off, and 2023 is a good start for that indeed.
And what does formalizing car sharing look like from a regulation standpoint?
Basically, you've got ways of penalizing it and subsidizing it or just supporting it. The classical one is parking cost, right? You can make parking crazy expensive for car sharing player. You can put a lot of tender processes behind it, applications and so on. Or you can make it fairly easy and incentivize that car sharing players can actually operate there. And with that, you also try to get additional players coming in there. Giving you a positive example is the city of Munich, the city of Stuttgart, that just recently made parking for car sharing players for free, while other players are just trying to penalize even having a car somehow, which for car sharing is maybe not the way to go, because like I said, cars are utilized, cars are driving around. We don't want to have cars standing there and block the city in itself. And with that, in the end, it helps to formalize really investments. For example, I, as a car sharing player, can put cars on the streets. I can have employers that also maybe don't want to have a car themselves. I can really bridge the gap of having all the needs I have. And of course, car sharing is not only in the bigger cities where it's maybe a good public transportation, but also maybe in smaller cities in the future. So the lines are blurring regulatory affairs do see that it's actually necessity to have it. You can't just solve it without cars, seemingly, but bridging the gap between all the mobility players is the way forward. And we do definitely see that this is finally the climate we are becoming, and they are more proactive, they involve us in discussions, which hasn't been the case 5 years ago, to be honest.
Mm-hmm. Thanks, Sven. And Simon, for on your side, on the Arval side, speaking about maybe corporate car sharing a bit more, what do you think will be the big breakthrough for car sharing in 2023?
So I think the two possible breakthrough that can be happening in 2023, one can be either rather positive, whereas the other one is actually quite negative. So let's start by the negative. So what we actually see, and some of the colleagues also went through, is that there are an additional pressure on company due to the macroeconomic times, post-COVID era, war in Ukraine, you name it. But all of those have reached to difficult times, inflation rate, and that puts additional pressure on companies. So bad news, good news is that for car sharing operators, it can also help those companies looking for any ways of reducing their mobility costs by providing car sharing services and actually make more with what they have and make their operation much more efficient. We said it in introduction. So that's on the bad side, but on the more positive side, I'm sure you haven't missed a recent decision of the European Commission to promote widespread adoption of EV vehicles. But of course, this has to be accompanied. It won't happen by himself. Today, most companies are using combustion engines, and they are looking for solutions that help them modify the mindset shift towards EVs. But especially what we see in big fleets, and especially more commercial fleets, like in the delivery sector, is that it's not that easy to transform from a combustion engine model towards an EV transportation models, because you don't want to be putting your employees in vehicles that are simply not just charged enough. So you need to be making sure that your vehicles are allocated in the most suitable way to perform your activities. And that's only can be done with getting access to data. And that's what car sharing services are all about. It's also getting data from vehicle, and notably on the charging status, on the battery capacity, everything that tomorrow will be making more and more efficient the operation of fleets will be actually data based. So that's a massive trend, and I'm for sure, it will accompany the widespread adoption of car sharing simply because company and also individuals will need it.
Thanks. Yeah. I think we also touched a little bit on the economic pressure that I think we're all facing, but maybe more generally or more specifically to thinking about car sharing and adoption, maybe just to go around the table and ask about the three key challenges that we need to overcome to grow the adoption of car sharing today. Can I start with you, Barath?
Yeah, sure. Thanks for that question, Harry. So again, as what the biggest thing that we're seeing now, I mean, the challenges used to be different a few years ago, but what we see now as a hurdle for car sharing is actually education and behavior change. I mean, a lot of the general public, I would say, or people who use car sharing, or when they compare it with public transport. So, and it is definitely not at the same price. It's more expensive than public transport because it provides a different convenience. But the right comparison is actually how does it compare to owning a car that you hardly use, right? It could be owning your first car or owning your second car, and in many cases, definitely owning a second car is much more expensive than using car sharing for the same convenience. So this is something that an argument or a realization that we hear again and again from consumers who use car sharing, and then sort of they see the mindset switch and sort of appreciate car sharing a lot more. And then there's also regulation and policy hurdles. But Sven is, I would say, sees this far more in detail and directly than us. So I'd let him sort of address this. And also infrastructure, zoning restrictions, parking restrictions, charging infrastructure from the cities. These are all sort of some challenges that we think need to be overcome for larger adoption.
I just let you follow on, Sven, if you want to.
Yeah, indeed. I mean, part of what you said is the definitely pressing points, right? Infrastructure in itself, a lot of cities have issues regarding CO2 values they need to meet. They want to have car sharing electric one day to the other, basically, but infrastructure is just not there often at times. We operate 30% of our fleet full electric, but not in all cities because not all cities have charging infrastructure. And with that interconnected is range anxieties, all those different cases as well. So I think there we can only do so much as operators, interconnected and supplied with our friends from Invers and so on, but also the structure needs to be built. People really need to recognize that sharing is important. And mostly indeed, it takes time, so to speak. I just mentioned earlier that it's getting out of the niche business, which is great, but also it still needs to be changed a little bit in terms of the operational model. Yeah, maybe sometimes it's where we're coming from free floating in bigger cities. In other ways, it's station based. Maybe in other cities, it's a completely different model. And I agree, just wrote down microcars. Maybe that is the solution, and it really needs to cater individually on the different locations. Which is tough if you want to earn money with that naturally, because there you need to also customize a lot. But on the other hand, you want to scalable, you want to give a good user experience. And I think we are all at this stage where we can deliver upon that, but still it takes effort and operational excellence.
Thanks, Finn. And finally, Simon, in terms of the challenges, where do you see the main challenges lying? And then once you've had your say, maybe let's go circle back round and we'll talk about maybe potential solutions to these problems.
So, of course, the challenges that businesses are facing are slightly different to the one that individuals may be facing. Nevertheless, what we actually see on the market is somehow, I would say, a paradox. Because when we talk with businesses, what we see is that usually the benefits of car sharing is well understood and often really perceived as a solution. So we really have the feeling that companies are actually ready and could be launching a car sharing program. But what we actually see in reality is that somehow companies and businesses seems to be reluctant to do it. So we try to understand, and one of the reasons of this is actually that we see that the perception of change is high. So for companies that today use keys, have owned vehicles to one individuals, it's relatively simple, and that's actually the kind of mobility that everyone is in this audience actually knows. But tomorrow, the introduction of technology, the sharing, operation remotely, all those kind of things are perceived as a massive change, and we see that that's actually one of the reasons why the companies seems to be not taking the plunge. So let me maybe start with directly with a possible solution of this. I think the solution actually relies on the shoulders of the car sharing operators, because they are the one that knows. Companies that are interested into launching a car sharing program, they don't know exactly how it's going to be looking like. They don't know what they need to be doing. What is the step? How they need to be training the people. So I think that's this responsibility is directly part of the service that the car sharing operator provides to their end clients, is actually the accompanying them from advising, consulting, the whole implementation process, and go all the way down. What is also important to see is at the end of the road, even though, let's be humble and honest with the companies, change has a price, and it can be sometimes difficult. But at the end of the road, so far so good. We've never seen one company turning back to the previous way of managing the fleet. So okay, cost is high, but at the end the benefits are there, and they will never come back.
Thanks, Simon. And yeah, so maybe to circle back to Barath. So how can we go about changing this, changing the behavior or educating people more about this?
I mean, I think there are several ways. I think one is actually I think the best education is actually to actually ride the car and provide more cars in cities, which can only be done if these hurdles are sort of crossed. So have like free parking or subsidized parking, make it cheaper to do this than actually own a car. And I think if you experience it a few times and see that, oh, you really don't need to own a car except for the occasional time when you really need it, you need a long trip with your family and so on. But otherwise, I think the more you use it, that's how it's sort of more pervasive.
And so if we're talking about, increasing the number of cars in a city, would you necessarily agree with putting more pressure on private car owners in city centers, so making parking more expensive for these private cars, or is that not necessarily a way to go? Is there a potential solution to making sure that whilst we're adding more shared cars, we can also sort of reduce the number of cars in city centers as a whole?
Yeah, I mean, some cities, I don't know if some cities do this, but actually, if you look at other sort of transitions that have happened, when transitions happen from like petrol vehicles to electric vehicles, it's so some governments kind of subsidize electric vehicles by charging more for or putting a tax or a fee or a cessation fee or something on combustion vehicles, right? So sometimes, in India, for example, they call this a fee bait. So you charge a fee to petrol vehicles, and then you rebate the electric vehicles. So sometimes it's possible, and it's been done in sort of, let's say, other transitions. But whether a city should, it really depends on the city and the geography of the city, how the city is spread out, and so on, for it to make sort of like to come to a decision point.
Thanks, Bharath. And Sven, turning to your point, so we think that there's a need for electrification of car fleets, as you said, but there isn't necessarily today the infrastructure to support it. What can we do? What can cities do even to accelerate this transition towards electric?
Simon, you had a great point about that, which is the usage of data. So what we did in the past is work together with city authorities and show them, hey, there is demand pattern, there's high utilization. At this spot, at this street, a new charging port would make the most sense. We bringing as car sharing operators right away utilization of that point because adoption of electric cars is not there yet and so on. So work closely together in the planning procedures, but also then work together in building the right infrastructure. Building slow chargers or building only fast chargers doesn't make sense. The right mix is important, and we can help. We already do help. We have done that in Munich, for example. We are also working in day-to-day business about how we charge our own cars. And it doesn't make sense that every operator, whatever kind of concept they have, is building up their own charging hubs, but public infrastructure is important. And with that, there is a lot to gain when we work together.
Mm-hmm. And maybe saying with you, Sven, talking about cities, what would be the qualities that make a city ideal for car sharing from an operator perspective?
So, of course, the classical ones like statistical data, demographics, what is the income structure, and so on. So that is the classical approach how we would assess the market. Maybe also qualitative targets, like how open they are to actually work together with you, because you can definitely put a car on the street and call it a day, but that's not working out in the long run. And on the other hand, what is the right business model behind that? So Share Now has started with free floating car sharing, which is really good for bigger cities, bigger urban sprawls, and so on. But you also need to steer a lot in terms of the number of cars, what is the right home area, so to speak. So in smaller cities, there it might be more suitable to have a station-based concept, where we also just tap into as Share Now and try to figure out how does it actually work, right? So in the end, the business models evolve, and I firmly believe there is a car sharing option for any city. You just need to find the right operating mode for that, have the right partners for that, and you can launch basically everywhere.
And how do you, as a car sharing operator, decide when you launch in a city which model you might want to achieve first? Because I guess you can do free floating and station based at the same time, but it might cause confusion with users. Maybe you want to start free floating or station based and then pivot towards the other one if it's not optimal. How have you? What's your take on that?
I think you need to start with either one or the other. That's a part of education, right? So if you train anyone to use station-based and suddenly it's free floating, then the next day it's something else that doesn't feel like it's making money. But in the end, it's a certain thresholds. Like if you have a big home area, like 150 square kilometers, find a lot of different stations doesn't really make sense in terms of efforts, but go for free floating because then the cars can be on the streets and then it's a chaotic floating. And things like that in the end, how is the city structure? Does it have a subculture? Is it in a city center? And I think there that mainly depends. Of course, number of people, if you have 1 million inhabitants, that's different setup than it's only 1,000 inhabitants, so to speak, right? So that's influencing factors.
And Barath, on that note, because you at Invers, you obviously work with a host of car sharing operators. What's the feedback that you get as a technology partner?
Yeah,
One ideal city.
Yeah, and the feedback that we get and also the data that we see is, an ideal city for car sharing or any mobility sharing, but especially for car sharing, is a city that we call as a polycentric city, right? What does this mean? This means it's a city that has a decentralized urban environment. And in this type of city, there's no single central business district or downtown area. Instead, there are multiple centers of activities that are distributed throughout the city. So these areas might include, commercial zones, residential zones, cultural zones, recreational zones, and so on. And there's often sort of, very sort of heavy movement between these different zones. And therefore, mobility is much more needed and much more of an option in these places. Whereas if you contrast this to a traditional, what used to be, I would say, an olden day city, where you have in the center of the city you have a central business district, and surrounding the maybe a few kilometers away you have several sort of residential areas, and so this would mean that people travel from residential area to the business district in the morning and do the reverse in the evening, and there's not much movement during the day, and there are only these two big zones, right?
Yeah.
Whereas if you have a polycentric city, there's constant movement required, and so this really sort of is very, very ideal for sharing and car sharing specifically.
And just to maybe put a name to one of these cities, do you have any cities in mind that you're thinking of when you say this in terms of European cities or?
Yeah, so one that I've seen sort of live and experienced this myself is Bangalore in India. That's where I come from, and the other one is, I would say, also London, because London has several commercial areas and sort of therefore also several residential areas. So for example, there's a central part of London near the bridge which has a lot of offices and so on. There's also Canary Wharf, which is a commercial center, and has several offices, especially the finance sector is there, and people sort of like live in different parts of the city and commute to these places, right? So and then there's also sort of different parts of London have like sporting areas, so there's football clubs, cricket stadiums, and so on, which also encourage a lot of movement or need a lot of movement. So this, I would say, is also an ideal city or an ideal polycentric city that we see.
Absolutely. And what's also interesting about London, although I've never actually lived there, I know it well from obviously being English. There are central, well, I would say business districts on the outskirts of the city as well, because it's sort of a sprawling mass, London. So it's not just concentrated on the city centre, but there are many drivable roads, I would say, between the very edge of the city, which is its own sort of town, if you will, and then the center of London as well. So yeah, I can definitely see that as a good example. All right, thanks very much. I think I had a couple more questions written down here. The main one before we get to maybe the final word and then we start the Q&A would be one that's maybe slightly more divisive, and it'd be really interesting to hear all three of your perspectives on this, which is, which form of car sharing do you think has the most growth potential? So here we're talking about car rental, car sharing like Share Now, or peer-to-peer car rental, car pooling, corporate car sharing. I don't know, from Simon, maybe you want to kick us off on this one?
Oh wow! That isn't the easiest for a niche operator of corporate car sharing. Well, honestly, I would say there are none. But then I'll give the mic to my colleague, to the colleagues. Actually, I think there are none because I think what will be driving the growth of car sharing has nothing to do with the scheme, has much to do with the way operators will actually adapt to local circumstances, to constraint they may have, and will respond to that with the best business model. See that it can be either P2P, either car rental, regardless. And actually, it only makes sense if that's the best way to answer customer needs under certain circumstances, regardless of the schema. So, of course, for corporate car sharing, that's slightly different because it's still a niche. But honestly, I wouldn't say there are none. Inventivity and smartness of the operators will make the difference, I'm sure.
Okay, so you put it down to innovation. Nice. Maybe Sven, you want to go next?
Certainly. Simon, you said none. I would say all of them have the growth potential because that is what we've definitely seen. And in the end, innovation is needed, but also it's that the lines are blurring between use cases, between the different systems, and so on. So B2B use cases for a car on the street, they are also there already for private people. Why can't it be used for the corporates? Is it a minute-based trip? Is it an hourly based? Is it even maybe going the direction of car rental, maybe up to 30 days? And we have observed development towards that direction, evolution even. And we do also think that this is going to be the future, that it's not only maybe the customer needs, the customer life cycle, maybe it's also closer to the vehicle life cycle in the end. So there's a lot of scalability and sustainability effects revolving around the business model. And the need is there. When people do recognize, and we touched upon education all the time now, recognize that this is working out for them, they will look for the mode of transportation that works best for them. And all in all, the different models always offer that individual mode of transportation for whatever I need in the end. The car is always at the tip of my finger when I use an app.
Perfect. Thanks, Sven. Barath, maybe?
Yeah, I mean, I would also sort of agree with Sven or go with Sven. All of them have a lot of potential. It's really hard to say. And just on this specific topic of blurring, right? This is also something we see, and we see, for example, there's the same operator that's offering station-based free-floating car sharing, station-based car sharing, car subscription, and then long-term. So you can take the same car for days or weeks or months also. But now there's another a new form that we begin to see is where a car sharing operator that has a fleet of thousands of cars is now putting like P2P cars on the network, right? So this is to me a blurring in a different dimension, where P2P used to be a different model, but now it's now a renowned established car sharing operator who has operational excellence and has been doing this for a few years is now taking the bet or even the challenge of providing the same experience, but with a car that they don't own and that they will just rent out for a few minutes or a few hours. So I think all of them are poised to grow.
All of them poised to grow. Seems like a unanimous decision from the three of you. That's great. So now, before we start the Q&A, I just wanted to ask the final question, which is actually the question that is on the top of the webinar. So something that I did when I was hosting a panel at the Autonomy conference in Paris was, you always often go to these panels, they never answer the question you go and see. It's sort of there. So let's answer that question now. So we have the technology. How can we accelerate widespread adoption? I don't know who wants to go on this one first. I'll leave it up to you, but fire away.
Sure, I'll go. So I think the widespread adoption will have to do with the fact that we need to be able to convince businesses, because that's mainly what we do as an operator, that actually it will answer their business. That will go in the way they are looking towards to. We said it has to do with operations, with fleet efficiency, to improve the usage rate, make more with less. Less idle times. We mentioned also many times the operational excellences. It's actually precisely what companies are looking towards to. Without forgetting the employee, at the end they are the one using apps, platforms, badges, you name it. they are actually the one making it really live. So, and they will be the end user of this. And it's absolutely important that in the adoption, we make sure that every time the customer journey is mostly digitalized is the best for them, because they will be the one accompanying it. Last and foremost, I get back to it, but CSR will be driving widespread adoption. I'm convinced with it. We see company driving more and more reports of CO2 emission. They need to be able to determine to authorities that they have been reducing CO2 footprint and so on and so forth. Nevertheless, we said it. Well, there is still that hassle that companies still need to take the plunge. So as a car sharing operator, we are more than convinced that the only way to do it is actually testing yourself, because it's all beautiful in theory. It kind of makes sense, but the change will be actually driven by moving to that reality, to theory to reality. And at Arval, we are convinced the only way to do it is actually to test it on your own. So we recently decided to promote a wide program of getting to our own clients and propose them to test the technology we provide to them for a certain period of time, so they can equip the technology and test the benefits that we've been promoting to them on the real case scenario, on their own fleets with their own employees. Well, and we are sure that's a good way to go, and really to unlock that change fear, or that mindset that it's just the click that missing, and I'm sure that's going to be making a difference.
Yeah, absolutely. Sven?
Indeed, experience, but was really important is scalability and building synergies about what you're doing. For us, we have 17 cities, and what the fleet management in Amsterdam is doing shall also be quite close to what someone in Berlin is doing, for example, right? So that's coming back to operation excellence, building up the same customer experience. Everything needs to be top notch. And now the narrow margin is you also want to earn money with that naturally, right? So that's a way of doing it, how you do that in the end. And we are at least in a stage where we say, okay, look, scalability is key. We need to know what we're doing. We have learned it over time. It also doesn't work sometimes. And indeed, it's in the title, technology is there. We do see that we are supported, and we in the end also see ourselves as a tech company, but we are providing a service. And how you do that in this environment and in this field is what we need to do best. And with that, it definitely can help the adoption itself.
Excellent. Thanks, Sven. And Bharath?
Yeah. So, I mean, our customers are actually car sharing operators, and we see it that as our responsibility to make sure that they are able to scale. Like Sven said, that's one of their goals, and they're able to scale in a sustainable manner. So profitability is very important, and I also see this as one of the questions that has been raised by the audience. So what we know, so we work closely with our operators to understand what their pain points are and find solutions, right? So one of the sort of things we've heard is up to 10% of revenue is sometimes lost in damages that are caused to the vehicles that are unattributed. You don't know who's done it, right? So now we have a solution for damage detection that allows you to sort of like detect when the damage has happened and sort of like go through the regular claims process. So to get you to reduce your costs in your P&L and go towards a path of profitability. So that's something that we sort of it's a new innovation that we're sort of driving to all our operators. The other thing towards this same sort of profitability goal is sharing of assets. So imagine there's a operator in a, let's say, a part of the city that has a lot of cars, at a certain point in the day, but has less demand for it. And there's another operator that has a less number of cars in that part of the city, but has high demand. The usual response would be, okay, now let me add more cars. I want to find cars, leasing or buying, go to the OEMs and buy them. But actually, there are already enough cars on the street. They just belong to a different operator. How can we share these assets, right? So it helps the city because the more cars are not added to the streets, but the citizens can still move. It helps both the operators because unutilized assets on revenue, and the operator that had less supply of cars but has more demand can actually serve that demand without having to buy new cars. So we call this feature as fleet share, and this is also something that got an award at Autonomy as well. So this is something that we're promoting among our operators and our customers to actually use heavily because it works for all stakeholders in the ecosystem.
Thanks, Gareth. Very clear. So, I mean, let's head on the Q&A now. I think we have a fair few questions. The first one that was asked was from Samuel. So how can a company or a car sharing provider find the optimal number of vehicles before implementation? I think this is something that all three of you could answer actually, but maybe from a car sharing operator perspective, maybe Sven, and then Simon afterwards, if you're interested.
Certainly. Thanks for the question, because it's really important coming down to what we said, data. In the end, there's a lot of data available. You can also do a lot of BI magic, so to speak, to analyze the demand patterns, the supply patterns. And without going into business secrets and so on, this is what we're basically doing. We're trying to take a look at what is the potential, let's say, flows in the city, how can we forecast it? But also it's a matter of development over time, right? So you probably start in a smaller area where assess that there's a higher demand at the beginning and then start to grow over time. So you just not start somewhere in the city and then suddenly everything is evolved, but actually you try to figure out over the time how's the adoption and so on, and grow with that. And basically, yeah, there's a lot of statistics, a lot of mathematics beforehand. You analyze and simulate, and then adapt accordingly in later stages when you are live.
Thanks, Sven. Yeah, sorry.
So, as far as companies are concerned, because we receive that question very often, how many cars do we need if we have 500, 1,000, 2,000 employees? And of course, there is no answer to that. The only way to answer to that question is actually to understand the whole mobility ecosystem of the client, because of course it really depends. It's not like you can say all the pharmaceutical companies have the same usage of vehicles. That's just not the case. So there's really going to be depending. So you have either two way of going. For big corporates, I'm sure that most of you know that they have they are imposed to provide mobility plans where they describe really high level and very details actually how their employee moves, and directly from them you can extract information that gives you relatively accurate data where you can say, okay, based on this, we think that you are making X trip per day, per month, per whatever, and then you can give a very clear answer. For those companies that don't have either the financials to do those kind of audits or that just are too small to doing it, usually we discuss with them and we try to understand how often today they are using their cars. And usually with time, what we see is that usually the number of trips per car will be rising throughout time, and that's precisely the end objective of company, is to make sure that the vehicles they are own, renting, whatever, are just simply used as much as possible. So I cannot straight away answer with the numbers. It will really depend case by case, but of course it's part of companies such as Arval to be able to understand that need and provide the best answer.
Thanks, Simon. And I just have another question for you, just so staying with you. Sorry, Barath, did you want us to add something on the end there? Or?
Yeah, so just one thing I would add, I mean, some data that we have seen that's, probably counterintuitive, and that's why I think it's interesting to share, is that as you add, and this is along the lines of what Simon said as well. So let's assume you have a city with 3,000 cars doing an average number of rides per day. So let's assume 4 rides per day per car and 3,000 cars. Now, if you add 500 cars, and you would assume that now the average rides per day would go down because now you have more cars and the same number of people. But what happens is actually what we have seen is that average rides per day now, this entire set of now 3,500 cars actually goes up because people are now able to find more cars and therefore they move around more than before. So this is actually something that we also see. So these experiments need to be done to figure out which is the right number of cars in a city. Okay.
Sorry, Barath. Yeah, sounds good. I just had to deal with, I've got 3 people coming into the room since we started the webinar, so not ideal. I have a question from Wasim from the chat, which is for Simon. It's how do you see the impact of the low emission zone French plan on car sharing in France? I know you're based in Belgium, but maybe you have an idea, and also actually maybe Barath or Sven. I know that they just introduced this in London. Do you see that these low emission zones, maybe not just in France but in Europe, could impact car sharing in a way?
So I'm not too familiar with the French low emission zone regulation, but if we look through Europe, I think notably of the Netherlands or in Belgium, that in some cases governments make an exception for car sharing because they consider that actually car sharing is a mobility shift towards less cars on the road. So they want to also promote that. So they want to make the distinction between a shared car and a regular car, even though it just looks like the same. And I think that's the best way to go. That's a very interesting way to go. So I think actually the low emission zone, also notably because more and more the car sharing operators are going towards electric, it's going to be also boosting the adoption. And actually, I kind of see that as an opportunity. But maybe I'm sure Sven and Barrett would also agree with that statement.
You definitely nailed and answered what I would like to answer as well, right? So there are some exemptions, like in Italy, for example, where you can actually use a car sharing car to drive into low emission zones, like in Rome, like in Turin. So that's the perfect way of how you can incentivize adoption of car sharing as a city, for example. In France, the question is it really a topic there? Because we are active in Paris with a fully electric fleet, so we are already fully electric. But it would limit, of course, private cars that are not low emission, company cars that are not low emission. So again, incentivization to actually use a car sharing car instead of an old stinker. And that is helpful in itself.
Perfect. Thanks very much, Sven. Very clear. I think that is a good place to leave it. I don't know whether you guys have time for one more question or not. Maybe just one more, and then any questions that have not been treated, we will make sure we get back to you afterwards. I'm sure that I'll make sure that your questions are transferred to the panelists. So this one's from Alexandre, and it's: how do you see the future collaboration between corporate car sharing and B2C or C2C car sharing as a way to provide flexible service to team members at the same time, optimize the costs of an idle fleet? It's quite a layered question there, but maybe for Simon or Sven, how does it?
We are doing it already as Share Now, right? Maybe not to the extent that it's a car that's fully blocked for corporate and that can be used for private citizens. But when you tap into station-based car sharing, that certainly offers that kind of way. So we're taking a look into that. And in the end, it's again about utilization, a car, the most specific way, working together, while at the other side. And I guess, Simon, you're definitely more the expert on that one, I guess. What is the need of the corporate? So I guess they want to have a car always at the fingertip. How can we ensure that, and so on? And there's a narrow margin behind it, but definitely it's utilizing the assets and trying to earn money with that, and growing together definitely does make sense, of course.
So I think that's a very interesting question, but it's still a bit futuristic. So we all agree today that that's tomorrow's life. So tomorrow we can imagine a world where the whole pool of vehicles, it's only be shared. So, but we're talking about 5, 10, 15, 20, 25 years in the years to come. So it's quite futuristic. And the reason I say this is because today there is still a frontier between B2B and B2C for actually really pragmatic reasons, is that the liability are completely different. And we don't see corporates enabling their fleets towards B2C, because in terms of insurance rate, price you pay, those kind of thing, it's really complex to be set in a. Nevertheless, I'm sure. I'm of course. I miss the crystal ball, of course, but I'm pretty sure that's going to be where the market's going to be. And at some point in time, each and every vehicle, regardless if it's a B2B, peer-to-peer, car rental, you name it, will actually all be shared. Maybe taking some time, but it's true to say that today, the so-called mutualization of fleets between corporates and the individuals is not really happening. It would be a good idea, but that's something that is really hard to put in place. So there is an intermediary solution, and we see that more and more by companies, is actually companies are offering their vehicles for weekends, holidays, nights to their own employees at a cheaper rate. So that's the so-called private use. Nevertheless, you still need to be an employee of a company to benefit from that service, and that's really be seen as an employee benefit, of course. And today, it's not offered to the outside world of the businesses.
Great. Thanks, Simon. So we covered a lot today. If we didn't get to your question, we apologize, but we'll make sure we follow up with the panel afterwards and reply to you privately. It sounds like car sharing has got quite a bright future, and there's not necessarily one particular model that's going to reign supreme. So it's good to know that there's room to grow for each of the different models out there. And we're excited to see where car sharing goes in Europe as we get into the late 2020s. So thanks again very much to our panel, Simon, Sven, and Barath. Pleasure having you, and thanks to you all for watching.
Much appreciated. Thank you, Ali.
Thank you so much. Take care.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Yeah,
Thanks for
bye-bye.
having us.
Bye bye.
Ciao.